Why did the Freedom Convoy happen? Some people say it was because of Russia. People who attended it say it was about freedom. But now, one national security expert, the incredibly badass Stephanie Carvin, has taken a crack at giving us some real answers. Her takeaway? The convoy was Canadian. It was the product of a polarized movement that has been growing in Canada for the last decade. One that has convinced a chunk of Canadians to believe that change is only possible through revolution. But this is where it gets interesting and might be one of the most important videos I've ever made. There were a bunch of conditions that set the stage for that democracy-threatening mindset. Here's what Carvin found. Unsurprisingly, the internet is a huge part of the problem. People tend to spend their time online around those who think the same as them, feeding on and seeking out content that confirms their views. On top of that, fake news stories get shared faster and farther than traditional news. Like-minded communities value winning over backing up their actual claims. And dominating conversations with a certain narrative is more important to them than proving its accuracy. One group has been especially good at exploiting this environment of polarized, like-minded social media communities, the far right. The far right repackaged itself, trading hate tattoos for polos and hair gel. It also changed its focus from race to identity, framing the fight as civilizational. At the same time, a far-right media ecosystem emerged, publishing unfounded and sensationalist stories on issues like immigration. Carvin names Rebel News and True North as examples. Far-right influencers also emerged. By 2015, Canada had an infrastructure in place that amplifies far-right and extremist narratives. And then some key developments took place. Go to part 2. This is part 2 of what might be the most important series I'll ever make. In part 1, we saw an emergence of an infrastructure on the far right that allows polarizing narratives to take hold much more easily in a small, enthusiastic group. Then, according to Carvin, 4 key things happened. First, Trump was elected, and he gave the public a permission slip to voice their hate shamelessly and loudly. They say when the US sneezes, Canada catches a cold. And Carvin found that's especially true with the far right. But domestic events also played a role here. When Trudeau was elected in 2015, he promised to bring 35,000 Syrian refugees to Canada. This fanned the flames of racist conspiracy theories, resulting in attacks on mosques and the emergence of extremist-led street patrols. Then there was M103, a non-binding motion in Parliament calling on Canada to condemn Islamophobia and all forms of religious discrimination. It triggered protests across the country from people who viewed it as an attack on free speech. Finally, there was the Yellow Vest movement, not the French one that focused on cost of living, the Canadian version that Carvin said focused on anti-Muslim, Islamophobic, and anti-immigrant conspiracy theories. This ultimately culminated in the 2019 United We Roll convoy, which got support from some conservative politicians. And while it tried to portray itself as pro-oil and gas, it ultimately focused on the UN Global Compact on Migration, a non-binding international agreement on the treatment of refugees. Then, in 2020, this anti-government and often conspiracy-driven movement found a new purpose. Go to the third and final part. This is part 3. By now, national security expert Stephanie Carvin has shown us that Canada had both the infrastructure and the permissive environment in place for the far right to flourish, and some key political events that contributed to the rise of this anti-government populist movement. But it hadn't yet found a way to get broader support from the public. Carvin said it found its answer in the lack of political leadership and the fatigue 2 years into the COVID pandemic. And the Freedom Convoy movement was born, with its focus on the pandemic shrouding the leadership's anti-government agenda. The 2022 Freedom Convoy, Carvin concludes, wasn't a spontaneous explosion of patriotism, but it also wasn't a foreign interference plot. It was the result of a growing Canadian far-right movement that made itself more accessible in terms of image and approach, exploited new social media tools, and found a new permissive environment in the wake of Donald Trump. A movement that often found common cause in anti-immigration, anti-government, Islamophobic, and conspiracy-driven beliefs. That appealed to enough people to make the movement viable. And while the trucks have gone home, Carvin warned this movement will find new ways of organizing. We'll keep encouraging people to toss out the ideas of politics and instead embrace anti-democratic revolution. Carvin concludes that this will keep placing strain on our democratic institutions, creating and amplifying distrust in democratic systems. This has already led to a surge in physical and verbal threats to politicians. And the narratives amplified by these groups have already inspired violence. So Carvin says dealing with the fallout of polarization in Canada and its impact on the far right will be one of the most important challenges for policymakers in the decades ahead. What do you think of all this?